Washington, D.C., March 17, 1978. The envelope arrived on a Thursday. Route carrier Thomas Brennan had been delivering mail to the same Georgetown addresses for 11 years, and he knew which houses got catalogs from Sears, which got letters with foreign stamps, which got nothing but bills. The house at 2847 Q Street Northwest received exactly one piece of mail every 2 weeks. Always the same cream-colored envelope, always the same typewriter font, always addressed to Margaret Hofstedt, always with a Philadelphia postmark. For 7 months, Thomas had noticed this pattern without thinking much about it. Mailmen notice patterns the way mechanics notice engine sounds. It's ambient awareness, not investigation. But on that Thursday in March, Thomas was running late because of a water main break on Wisconsin Avenue, and he was sorting through his leather satchel at 2:13 in the afternoon instead of his usual 10:45 morning slot. When he pulled out the cream envelope for 2847 Q Street, he saw something that made his hands stop moving. There was another cream envelope beneath it. Same typewriter, same Margaret Hofstedt, same Philadelphia postmark. But this second envelope was dated 8 days earlier. It had been sitting in the mail sorting facility, delayed by some clerical error. And now Thomas was holding 2 envelopes that should have arrived on different weeks, in his hands at the same moment. He stood on the sidewalk with both envelopes, the March wind pulling at his uniform jacket, and he realized something that would destroy 3 lives and expose a Soviet intelligence network that had been operating undetected since 1969. The envelopes were identical. Not similar. Identical. Same cream stock. Same typewriter. Same spacing between letters. Same pressure on the keys. Same slight imperfection, where the lowercase e printed slightly higher than the other letters. These weren't letters, they were productions. Before we continue with what Thomas did next, I need to know something. Drop a comment below telling me what city and country you're watching from right now. And if stories like this, where ordinary people stumble into something far bigger than themselves, pull you in, hit that like button and subscribe. These cases don't get told often enough. Now back to Thomas Brennan and those 2 envelopes. Thomas Brennan was 42 years old in March 1978. He had been a mail carrier since 1967, starting just after his discharge from the Army, where he'd served as a supply clerk at Fort Bragg. He was not an analytical person by nature. He had graduated from Coolidge High School in 1954 with unremarkable grades and had spent 2 years working at a Texaco station on Georgia Avenue before his draft notice arrived. His wife, Patricia, worked part-time at a Woodward and Lothrop department store. They had 2 daughters, both in junior high. Thomas drove a 1973 Ford LTD that needed new shocks. He bowled on Thursdays. He drank Schlitz. He voted but couldn't tell you much about policy. He was, in every documentable way, the kind of person who keeps a society running by doing the same task competently, day after day, without requiring supervision or acclaim. The Georgetown route was considered a good assignment in the Postal Service hierarchy. The houses were well maintained. The residents didn't complain much. There was less crime than in other parts of the district. Thomas knew the neighborhood the way a long-term tenant knows an apartment building. He could tell you which brownstone had the loose 3rd step, which mailbox had a stuck hinge, which address always had packages too large for the slot. He knew that 2847 Q Street was owned by a woman named Margaret Hofstedt, who appeared to be in her late 60s, always wore dark clothing, and never made eye contact when she answered the door for certified mail. He had delivered to her for 11 years and had probably exchanged fewer than 50 words with her total. The house itself was unremarkable for Georgetown. 3 stories, red brick, black shutters, built sometime in the 1920s. Small front yard with hedges that were always precisely trimmed, no decorations in the windows, no political signs, no religious symbols. The curtains were heavy and always drawn. Thomas had never seen anyone enter or leave the house except Margaret Hofstedt herself. No visitors, no service people, no deliveries except mail. In 11 years he had never seen a light on inside, even in winter evenings when he ran late and delivered after dark. The house existed in a state of perfect neutral maintenance, Not welcoming, not hostile, simply present. Standing on that sidewalk in March 1978, holding two identical envelopes, Thomas felt something shift in his understanding of his own job. He had always thought of mail delivery as a simple mechanical task. Take item from bag, put item in box, move to next address. But now he was aware that he was holding information. These envelopes contained something, and the pattern of their arrival meant something, and the fact that they were identical productions rather than genuine correspondence meant something. He stood there for almost 3 minutes, according to his later testimony, trying to decide what to do. He could deliver both envelopes and forget about it. He could deliver both envelopes and mention the oddity to his supervisor. He could deliver one envelope and hold the other. He could open one envelope. He could report both envelopes to someone, though he wasn't sure who that someone would be. The decision he made in those 3 minutes would eventually lead to the arrest of 4 people, the recall of 2 Soviet diplomatic personnel, the closure of a surveillance operation that had been photographing documents at the Library of Congress for 9 years, and the identification of a microfilm dead drop system that had been used to transmit information about congressional staffers since the early 1970s. But Thomas Brennan didn't know any of that when he made his decision. He just knew the envelopes were wrong. He delivered one envelope to 2847 Q Street. He put it through the mail slot in the black front door at 2:17 p.m., according to the time he wrote on his route sheet later. Then he walked back to his postal truck, put the second envelope in his personal satchel instead of his official mail bag, and continued his route. At 4:35 p.m., when he returned to the Georgetown Postal Station on Wisconsin Avenue, he asked to speak with his supervisor, a man named Frank Kerrigan, who had been with the Postal Service since 1951. Thomas showed him the second envelope and explained the pattern he'd noticed. Frank looked at the envelope, looked at Thomas, and said something that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. "You sure you want to start this?" Thomas said he didn't know what "this" was. Frank said, "Neither do I. But once you make a report about something like this, it doesn't just go away. It goes up." Thomas asked where "up" meant. Frank said he wasn't sure, but probably somewhere that asked a lot of questions. Thomas thought about it for maybe 30 seconds, then said he wanted to make a report. Frank sighed, went into his office, and made a phone call. The context for understanding what happened next requires stepping back into the operational environment of Washington, D.C. during the late 1970s. The Cold War had entered a phase that intelligence historians now call the bureaucratic stalemate. Both sides had achieved rough parity in nuclear capability, both sides had extensive satellite reconnaissance, both sides had learned to operate within each other's intelligence methodologies, and the result was a kind of frozen conflict, where small advantages were pursued through incremental espionage, rather than dramatic operations. The CIA and KGB both maintained extensive networks in each other's capitals, operating under diplomatic cover, academic cover, journalistic cover, and various forms of deep cover that involved false identities and long-term penetration of civilian institutions. By 1978, the FBI's counterintelligence division estimated that there were approximately 400 Soviet intelligence officers operating in the United States under various forms of cover, and an unknown number of American citizens who had been recruited as assets, agents, or sources. The reciprocal number of American intelligence officers in Soviet territory was believed to be smaller, primarily because the Soviet system made deep cover penetration significantly more difficult. Washington specifically was understood to be a city where espionage was simply part of the infrastructure. The Soviet embassy on 16th Street Northwest was known to house a substantial intelligence apparatus. Every Soviet citizen working in any official capacity in Washington was assumed to have some relationship with either the KGB or GRU. The FBI maintained surveillance teams, but the volume of potential targets far exceeded the available personnel. The result was a system of selective monitoring, where specific high-priority subjects received intensive coverage, while the larger population of suspected intelligence officers operated under only periodic observation. The FBI's Washington field office had a dedicated unit called the Soviet Espionage Branch, but even that unit had to make constant decisions about resource allocation. A full surveillance operation, following someone 24 hours a day with rotating teams, monitoring their communications, documenting their contacts, required enormous manpower. Most suspected intelligence officers were simply noted, catalogued, and checked periodically. This is the environment that Thomas Brennan's phone call entered. Frank Kerrigan called the postal inspector's office, which was the standard procedure for any irregular mail situation. The postal inspector on duty that evening was a woman named Claire Demont, who had been with the inspection service for 6 years. She came to the Georgetown station at 6:15 p.m., interviewed Thomas, examined the envelope he'd held back, looked at his route sheets showing the pattern of deliveries to 2847 Q Street, and made her own assessment. She told Thomas she was going to forward the information to the FBI, which had jurisdiction over counterintelligence matters. She asked Thomas not to discuss the matter with anyone, including his wife. She asked him to maintain his normal route and delivery pattern. She asked him to note any future envelopes matching this description. Thomas asked if he was in any trouble. Claire said no, but that he'd done the right thing by reporting it. Thomas went home that evening and didn't tell Patricia what had happened. He heated up leftover pot roast, watched part of a Bullets game on television, and went to bed without being able to sleep for more than a few hours. The envelope that Thomas had held back was opened by FBI analysts 3 days later, on March 20th, 1978. It contained a single piece of paper with a typed list of numbers. No text, no explanation. Just numbers arranged in groups of 5 digits, 17 groups total. The pattern was immediately recognizable to anyone with counterintelligence training as a simple numerical code, probably corresponding to a prearranged key. The numbers themselves were meaningless without the key, but the existence of coded numerical messages being delivered to a residential address through the postal system was significant. The FBI opened a preliminary investigation with the designation WFO CI 784, which indicated Washington Field Office, Counterintelligence Case Number 784 for that year. Margaret Hofstedt of 2847 Q Street Northwest became the subject of surveillance. The surveillance began with archives. FBI records showed no previous investigation of anyone named Margaret Hofstedt at that address. Property records showed that the house had been purchased in 1969 for $38,000 by a Margaret Hofstedt, age 64 at time of purchase, who had listed her occupation as retired secretary. The previous owner had been an estate sale. The house had belonged to a deceased government clerk. Margaret Hofstedt had no mortgage. She'd purchased the house with cash. Utility records showed regular payment of electric, gas, water, and telephone bills, always on time, always by mailed check. Tax records showed she filed returns every year reporting income from Social Security and a small pension from the Department of Agriculture, where she claimed to have worked as a clerical employee from 1943 to 1968. The FBI contacted the Department of Agriculture Personnel Office and requested employment records for Margaret Hofstedt. The records existed. She had indeed worked as a filing clerk in the Agricultural Statistics Service from 1943 to 1968, retiring at age 63. Her employment file contained nothing unusual. Annual reviews were adequate, no security incidents, no remarkable achievements, just 25 years of filing and clerical work. But when FBI analysts looked more carefully at the paperwork, they noticed something. Margaret Hofstedt's Social Security number had been issued in Maryland in 1942. But her Department of Agriculture employment application filed in 1943 listed her previous address as Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The FBI requested additional records from Social Security Administration. Margaret Hofstedt had started paying into Social Security in 1942, working at a cannery in Baltimore. She'd worked there for 8 months, then apparently moved to Washington and started at the Department of Agriculture. But there was no record of her before 1942. No birth certificate on file, no school records, no previous employment, no census data before 1940. In 1940, there was no Margaret Hofstedt listed anywhere in census records. She appeared to have come into existence in 1942 at age 37, with no documented history before that point. This was not impossible. Records from the early 20th century were often incomplete, especially for women, especially for people who had moved frequently or lived in rural areas. But combined with the coded envelopes, it was significant enough to warrant deeper investigation. The FBI placed Margaret Hofstedt under physical surveillance on March 27, 1978. A rotating team of agents maintained observation of 2847 Q Street for the next 6 weeks. They documented her movements, which were minimal. She left the house approximately 3 times per week, always in the late morning, always on foot. She walked to a Safeway supermarket on Wisconsin Avenue, purchased small amounts of groceries, and returned home. She walked to a bank branch on M Street once every 2 weeks and conducted brief business at the teller window. She walked to a pharmacy on P Street once a month. She never varied her routes. She never stopped to speak with anyone. She never looked around as if checking for surveillance. She walked with the steady, unremarkable pace of an elderly woman doing necessary errands. She wore dark dresses and a dark coat. She carried a black handbag. She never made eye contact with anyone. The FBI surveillance teams noted that she was almost perfectly forgettable. Even the agents watching her had difficulty describing her appearance in detail beyond elderly woman, average height, gray hair, dark clothing. This level of practiced anonymity was itself a red flag. People with nothing to hide don't usually refine the art of being unmemorable. During these 6 weeks, Thomas Brennan continued his mail route. He delivered 3 more cream-colored envelopes to 2847 Q Street, each arriving on a 2-week interval. He noted the dates and reported them to Claire DeMont. The FBI obtained mail covers authorization, legal permission to record information from the outside of mail without opening it, and documented every piece of mail delivered to the address. Besides the regular cream envelopes from Philadelphia, Margaret Hofstedt received only utility bills, grocery store circulars, and occasional catalogs. No personal correspondence, no magazines, no letters from friends or family. The phone tap installed on her line recorded 0 outgoing calls and only 3 incoming calls during 6 weeks, all from automated sales messages. The FBI's investigation expanded in early May 1978 when analysts began examining the Philadelphia connection. Every cream envelope had carried a Philadelphia postmark, always from the main processing facility on Chestnut Street. The Bureau dispatched 2 agents to Philadelphia to review postal records and attempt to trace the origin of the mailings. What they discovered added another layer to the operation. The envelopes were being dropped into a blue collection box on Market Street, always on a Tuesday evening between 6 and 8 p.m. based on the collection timestamps. The box was located in a busy commercial area with heavy foot traffic, making visual surveillance impractical. But the timing was significant. The envelopes appeared in that collection box every 2 weeks with mechanical regularity. Someone was maintaining a precise schedule. Philadelphia field agents established observation on the collection box for 4 consecutive Tuesday evenings in May. On the 3rd Tuesday, May 16, 1978, at 7:23 p.m., they observed a man approach the collection box, pause briefly to deposit something, and continue walking. The agents followed him for 6 blocks until he entered an apartment building on Spruce Street. They noted his physical description: white male, approximately 50 years old, average height, wearing a tan jacket and dark trousers, carrying a newspaper under his arm. The next day, FBI agents identified the man as Robert Chenoweth, age 51, who worked as an accountant for a shipping company at the Philadelphia port. They ran his background and found nothing remarkable. He'd lived in Philadelphia his entire life, graduated from Temple University in 1949 with a degree in accounting, married in 1952, divorced in 1968, no children. He'd worked for the same shipping company since 1953. He owned a small 2-bedroom apartment. He filed taxes regularly. He had no criminal record. He had never traveled outside the United States except for a brief trip to Canada in 1962. He appeared to be exactly what his documentation suggested, a middle-aged accountant living a quiet, unremarkable life. But the FBI couldn't ignore the coincidence. They opened a parallel investigation into Chenoweth and discovered something interesting in his employment records. The shipping company he worked for, Delaney Maritime Services, handled cargo documentation for commercial vessels, including ships from Soviet bloc countries. Chenoweth's specific role involved processing customs paperwork and freight manifests. He had regular access to information about what ships were arriving, what cargo they carried, and what their crew rosters listed. This wasn't classified information, it was commercial data, publicly available in various forms, but it was exactly the kind of detailed logistical intelligence that could be useful for tracking patterns, identifying cover identities, or planning operations. The shipping industry was known to be a common target for intelligence services on both sides because it provided legitimate reasons to track movements, documentation, and personnel across international borders. The FBI placed Chenoweth under surveillance and obtained authorization for a mail cover on his residence. Over the next 3 weeks, they documented his routine. He went to work 5 days a week, always arriving at 8:30 a.m. and leaving at 5:15 p.m. He stopped at the same diner for lunch, always ordering a sandwich and coffee. He went to a laundromat every Saturday morning. He went to a public library every Sunday afternoon. He had no apparent social life, no visitors to his apartment, no phone calls except work-related contacts. Every other Tuesday evening, he walked from his apartment to the Market Street collection box and deposited a cream-colored envelope. The FBI never observed him preparing these envelopes. He must have done so inside his apartment, where they had no visual access. But the pattern was now confirmed. Robert Chenoweth was producing the coded messages being sent to Margaret Hofstedt. The question was why. Intelligence operations typically involve some form of compensation, control, or ideological motivation. The FBI found no evidence that Chenoweth was receiving unusual income. His bank records showed a steady salary deposit every 2 weeks, modest savings, and regular payments for rent, utilities, and basic expenses. No large cash deposits, no unexplained purchases, no foreign bank accounts. If he was being paid for intelligence work, the money wasn't moving through any visible channel. Investigators considered the possibility that he was being compensated through some other method, perhaps payments to an offshore account, perhaps valuable items transferred through intermediaries, perhaps blackmail or coercion, but there was no evidence for any of these scenarios. Chenoweth appeared to be living on his documented salary, spending modestly, and maintaining the lifestyle of someone who earned exactly what his employment records indicated. The FBI decided to take a more aggressive approach. On June 8, 1978, they obtained a warrant to search Chenoweth's apartment while he was at work. The entry was conducted by a specialized team trained in covert searches, entering a location, examining and photographing everything and leaving no trace of their presence. The search lasted 4 hours. What they found was significant, but not immediately conclusive. In a locked drawer in Chenoweth's bedroom dresser, beneath several layers of clothing, they discovered a small metal box. Inside the box were 3 items: a typewriter ribbon that appeared to be heavily used, a sheet of paper with columns of 5-digit numbers, and a black and white photograph of a young woman standing in front of a building that analysts later identified as a university in Prague, Czechoslovakia, based on architectural details visible in the background. The photograph was dated 1949 on the reverse side, written in faded pencil. No name, no other notation. The FBI photographed everything, returned it exactly as they'd found it, and departed. Analysts began working on the number sheet, attempting to determine if it was a cipher key or code reference. The typewriter ribbon was examined and found to contain impressions consistent with the style and formatting of the envelopes being sent to Margaret Hofstedt. The same slight elevation on the lowercase e, the same spacing patterns. The photograph became the subject of intensive investigation. Who was the woman? Why was this the only photograph Chenoweth kept? Why was it locked away with materials related to coded communications? The FBI submitted the photograph to facial recognition databases, cross-referenced it with immigration records from 1949, and sent copies to CIA analysts who specialized in Eastern European operations. It took 3 weeks to get a potential identification. The woman in the photograph was believed to be Anna Malikova, a Czech national who had been a student at Charles University in Prague in 1949. According to records obtained through intelligence liaison with Czech defectors, Malikova had been recruited by Soviet intelligence in 1950 and trained as a deep cover agent. She disappeared from Czech records in 1951. The CIA had a thin file on her. She'd been mentioned in a defector debriefing in 1962 as someone who had been sent to the West for long-term penetration work, but there were no details about her cover identity, her assignment, or her status. The file listed her as presumed active, location unknown. If Anna Malikova and Margaret Hofstedt were the same person, then the FBI had uncovered a Soviet illegal, an intelligence officer operating under false identity without diplomatic protection, living a completely fabricated civilian life as cover for espionage activities. The implications were substantial. Illegals were the most difficult intelligence officers to detect because they had no official connection to Soviet institutions. They couldn't be expelled as diplomats. They couldn't be tracked through embassy contacts. They lived as ordinary citizens, sometimes for decades, waiting to be activated or serving as communication nodes for other operations. The FBI had identified and arrested Soviet illegals before, the most famous case being Rudolf Abel in 1957, but such cases were rare because illegals were, by design, nearly invisible. If Margaret Hofstedt was Anna Malikova, then she'd been living in Washington under false identity since at least 1969, possibly earlier. The question was what she'd been doing during that time, and who else was involved in her network. The FBI intensified surveillance on both Hofstedt and Chenoweth, while analysts worked to decrypt the coded messages. They brought in specialists from the National Security Agency who had experience with Soviet cipher systems. The numbers in the envelopes appeared to be using a basic substitution code, where each 5-digit group corresponded to a word or phrase from a predetermined list. Without the code book, the physical document that listed what each number meant, the messages were difficult to decrypt. But NSA analysts noticed something useful. The messages showed repeated number groups, and the frequency of repetition suggested they were reporting routine information rather than urgent intelligence. The pattern indicated regular status reports rather than operational communications. This was consistent with what's called a sleeper protocol, an agent maintaining minimal contact just to confirm they're still in place and operational. By late June 1978, the FBI had assembled a substantial case file but faced a strategic decision. They could arrest Hofstedt and Chenoweth immediately, which would disrupt the network but potentially miss other connected assets. Or they could continue surveillance and attempt to map the entire operation, which carried the risk that the subjects might detect the investigation and flee or destroy evidence. The decision was complicated by bureaucratic factors. The FBI's counterintelligence division was under significant pressure from Congress following revelations about past domestic surveillance overreach. Any espionage case needed to be airtight before arrests were made. The Bureau couldn't afford another public failure or controversy. They decided to extend the surveillance and attempt a more sophisticated operation. They would try to follow the information chain beyond just Hofstedt and Chenoweth. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Thomas Brennan, who had continued his normal mail route throughout the investigation, noticed something else odd in July. He was delivering mail to an address 4 blocks from Margaret Hofstedt's house, 2614 P Street Northwest, when he saw Hofstedt walking past on the opposite side of the street. This wouldn't have been remarkable except for 2 details. First, it was a Thursday afternoon at 2:30 p.m., and Hofstedt normally only left her house in late morning for her grocery and banking trips. Second, she walked past 2614 P Street, continued to the corner, stopped for approximately 30 seconds as if looking at something, then turned and walked back the way she'd come. Thomas had been trained by the FBI to notice and report any deviation from normal patterns. He noted the time, location, and behavior in his daily report to Claire Dumont. FBI surveillance teams reviewed their logs and realized they'd missed this movement. They'd been maintaining observation on Hofstedt's house but hadn't followed her on this particular afternoon because she'd left through her back door, a route she'd never used before in 3 months of surveillance. The surveillance team had been positioned to watch the front of the house and hadn't seen her leave. This suggested she might be aware of surveillance and had deliberately used an alternate exit. Or it suggested she was conducting some kind of operation that required specific timing and route. Either way, it was significant. The FBI increased their surveillance coverage and paid particular attention to 2614 P Street. The address was a larger residential building divided into apartments, 9 units total. The FBI identified all the tenants and began background checks. Most were unremarkable: young professionals, a retired couple, a graduate student. But one tenant drew attention. Apartment 4, on the 3rd floor, was rented to a man named Dennis Hartwell, age 35, who worked as a research assistant at the Library of Congress. He'd held that position since 1973. His employment records showed he worked in the manuscript division, which handled historical documents, personal papers of notable Americans, and various archived materials. The FBI ran a full background on Hartwell and found something interesting. He'd traveled to East Germany in 1971 as part of a university exchange program, spending 6 months in East Berlin, supposedly studying German library science. Travel to East Germany was legal, but unusual, and it was exactly the kind of experience that Soviet intelligence services used as recruitment opportunities. The FBI obtained authorization to place Hartwell under surveillance and discovered a pattern. Every 2 weeks, on Wednesday evenings, Hartwell left his apartment carrying a leather briefcase. He walked to various locations in Georgetown and surrounding neighborhoods, sometimes a park, sometimes a shopping area, sometimes a metro station, and he always made the same series of movements. He would stop at a specific location, pretend to tie his shoe or look at something, place the briefcase down for a moment, then pick it up and continue walking. FBI counter-surveillance teams recognized this as a classic dead-drop technique, leaving materials at a predetermined location for pickup by another person without direct contact. The briefcase was likely being switched with an identical briefcase during those brief moments when Hartwell set it down. Over the next 4 weeks, FBI agents followed Hartwell's pattern and identified his dead-drop locations. Then they established surveillance on those locations after Hartwell departed. On August 3, 1978, they observed a woman approach one of Hartwell's drop sites, a bench in Montrose Park, approximately 20 minutes after Hartwell had left. The woman sat on the bench, placed her handbag next to the briefcase that Hartwell had left, appeared to rest for a few minutes, then stood up and walked away carrying the briefcase that Hartwell had left. She'd left her handbag on the bench. FBI agents followed the woman and identified her as Margaret Hofstedt. They then returned to the bench and retrieved the handbag she'd left. Inside was an identical briefcase to the one Hartwell had been carrying. The switch had been executed cleanly. Hofstedt was serving as a courier between Hartwell and some other destination. The FBI now had evidence of an active espionage network with at least 3 participants. Chenoweth sending coded instructions from Philadelphia, Hofstedt receiving those instructions and coordinating activities in Washington, and Hartwell stealing or photographing documents from the Library of Congress and passing them through dead drops. The question was what kind of documents Hartwell had access to and what made them valuable enough to justify this level of operational security. The Library of Congress housed millions of documents, but most were publicly available. What could Hartwell access that couldn't be obtained through normal channels? FBI agents consulted with Library of Congress security officials and learned something concerning. The manuscript division, where Hartwell worked, included a special collection of papers donated by retired government officials, military personnel, and diplomats. These collections often contained personal correspondence, diary entries, unpublished memoirs, and working documents that reflected internal government discussions and decision-making processes. While these materials were technically available to researchers, they were not widely publicized and access required specific knowledge of what existed in the collections. Someone with Hartwell's position could systematically identify materials of intelligence value, documents that revealed how policies were actually formed, who disagreed with whom, what alternatives were considered, what personality conflicts shaped decisions. This wasn't classified information in the legal sense, but it was exactly the kind of detailed insight into American government thinking that Soviet analysts would find valuable for predicting future policy directions. The FBI decided to monitor what Hartwell was accessing. They worked with Library of Congress administrators to flag Hartwell's request for materials and quietly photograph everything he examined. Over 3 weeks in August, they documented that Hartwell had requested and reviewed materials from the personal papers of several former State Department officials, congressional staffers who had worked on foreign policy committees, and retired military officers who had served in strategic planning positions. He was systematically working through collections that dealt with Cold War policy formation during the 1960s and early 1970s. He was photographing specific documents using a miniature camera concealed in what appeared to be a regular pen. The FBI obtained clear surveillance footage of him doing this on August 18, 1978. By September 1978, the FBI had assembled a comprehensive case file showing a functioning Soviet intelligence network that had been operating undetected for years. They had evidence of coded communications, dead drops, document theft, and at least 3 active participants. But they still had questions. Where were the documents going after Hofstedt picked them up from the dead drops? Who was Hofstedt passing them to? Was this network connected to other operations? The FBI decided to maintain surveillance through one more complete cycle, from Chenoweth sending a message to Hartwell, making a drop to Hofstedt, collecting the material to whatever happened next. On September 12, 1978, Chenoweth mailed another cream envelope from Philadelphia. It arrived at Hofstedt's house on September 14th. Hartwell made a dead drop on September 13th. Hofstedt picked up the dead drop on September 13th. Then, on September 19th, Hofstedt did something she'd never done before in 6 months of surveillance. She left her house at 6:45 a.m., far earlier than her normal late-morning routine, carrying a small canvas bag. She walked to a metro station, took a train toward Maryland, and exited at a station in Bethesda. FBI agents followed her as she walked to a commercial area and entered a copy shop called Quickprint that had just opened at 7 a.m. She stayed inside for 17 minutes. When she emerged, she was no longer carrying the canvas bag. She walked back to the metro, returned to Georgetown, and arrived home by 9:15 a.m. FBI agents entered the copy shop and showed credentials to the employee who had been working that morning, a 19-year-old college student named Kevin Mills who worked the early shift. They asked if he remembered the elderly woman who had just left. He said yes. She'd come in and requested to use the shop's Xerox machine for about 15 minutes. She'd paid cash. She'd operated the machine herself, saying she preferred to handle her own documents. She'd brought her own paper. She'd cleaned up after herself and left. Kevin said she'd been polite but hadn't said much. The FBI asked what kind of documents she'd been copying. Kevin said he hadn't looked closely, but they appeared to be typed pages, possibly old letters or documents. She'd made multiple copies of each page. The FBI realized they'd discovered how the network transmitted intelligence. Hofstedt was making copies of the documents Hartwell stole from the Library of Congress. She was probably then passing these copies to a Soviet handler through another dead drop or direct meeting that the FBI hadn't yet identified. The use of a public copy shop was smart tradecraft. It left no connection to her residence, no equipment that could be searched, no physical evidence except during the brief window when she was actually making copies. The FBI decided they had enough evidence to move toward arrests, but they wanted to identify the final recipient of the copied documents before shutting down the operation. They placed surveillance on the Quickprint shop and monitored it for the next 2 weeks. On October 3, 1978, Hofstedt returned at 7:05 a.m. with another canvas bag. FBI agents were positioned both inside and outside the shop. As soon as Hofstedt left, they approached Kevin Mills and asked to see the documents she'd been copying. They photographed several pages still in the Xerox machine's paper tray. The documents were from the personal papers of a former Assistant Secretary of State who had died in 1975. The specific pages dealt with internal debates about nuclear arms control negotiations during the Nixon administration. They contained handwritten margin notes showing disagreements between State Department officials and National Security Council staff about negotiating positions. This was historical information, already a decade old, but it revealed the internal dynamics of how American policy had actually been formed. Exactly the kind of material that Soviet analysts would use to build psychological profiles and understand decision-making patterns. By the way, let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching this right now. Middle of the night? Early morning? And if you're still following this case, consider hitting that like button and subscribing so you don't miss how this network finally came apart. The FBI's next challenge was following Hofstedt after she left the copy shop to see where the documents ended up. They deployed a full surveillance team, 6 agents in 3 vehicles plus 4 on foot, to maintain visual contact without being detected. Hofstedt took the metro back toward Washington but exited at a different station than usual in the Cleveland Park neighborhood. She walked to a residential street lined with apartment buildings and small houses. She stopped at a bus shelter, sat on the bench, and placed the canvas bag beside her. She appeared to be waiting for a bus. 3 minutes later, a man in a dark coat sat down on the same bench, placed his newspaper between himself and Hofstedt, and appeared to read it. After approximately 2 minutes, the man stood up, picked up the canvas bag that Hofstedt had placed on the bench and walked away. Hofstedt remained seated. She never looked at the man. The exchange took less than 3 minutes total. FBI agents followed the man for 6 blocks until he entered an apartment building. They identified him as Yuri Petrov, age 44, who worked as a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy. Petrov had diplomatic immunity, which meant he couldn't be arrested or prosecuted under American law. But his involvement confirmed that the network was operating under Soviet intelligence direction. The FBI now had evidence connecting Soviet diplomatic personnel to an espionage operation involving American citizens stealing documents and transmitting them through an illegal agent. This was exactly the kind of case the Bureau needed to justify counterintelligence resources and demonstrate that Soviet espionage remained an active threat. The FBI decided to move toward arrests, but faced legal and diplomatic complications. They could arrest Chenoweth, Hofstedt, and Hartwell on espionage charges, but Petrov couldn't be touched because of diplomatic immunity. The State Department would declare him persona non grata and expel him from the country, but he wouldn't face prosecution. The FBI also needed to be careful about how they revealed their case. If they disclosed too much about surveillance methods, they might compromise other ongoing operations. If they didn't disclose enough, defense attorneys might challenge the evidence as insufficient. The decision was made to arrest all 3 Americans simultaneously on October 17, 1978, before any of them could be warned or destroy evidence. Thomas Brennan learned about the arrests from the evening news. He was at home watching television when a report came on describing the FBI's announcement of a Soviet espionage network operating in Washington. The reporter mentioned that a postal worker had initially noticed suspicious mail patterns and reported them to authorities, leading to a 6-month investigation. Patricia asked Thomas if he knew anything about it. He said he might have. She asked what he meant. He explained about the envelopes, the report he'd made, the FBI investigation he'd been told not to discuss. Patricia was quiet for a long time, then asked if he'd been in danger. Thomas said he didn't think so. He'd just delivered mail. Patricia said that sometimes the simplest observations led to complicated consequences. Thomas didn't argue with that. The arrests took place at dawn on October 17, 1978, coordinated across 3 locations. FBI agents entered Robert Chenoweth's Philadelphia apartment at 6 a.m. while he was still asleep. They found him in bed, confused and disoriented, asking what was happening. When they told him he was being arrested for espionage, he didn't resist. He didn't say anything. He just stood there in his pajamas, while agents searched his apartment and collected evidence. They seized the metal box from his dresser, along with files, papers, and a typewriter that matched the distinctive impressions on the envelopes sent to Margaret Hofstedt. Chenoweth was read his rights, handcuffed, and transported to FBI headquarters in Philadelphia. During the entire process, according to the agent's later reports, he maintained complete silence except to confirm his name and date of birth. Margaret Hofstedt was arrested at her Georgetown house at 6:03 a.m. FBI agents knocked on the door, and when she didn't answer, used a warrant to force entry. They found her in the kitchen, already dressed despite the early hour, sitting at a small table with a cup of tea. She looked at the agents and said, in English with no detectable accent, "I've been expecting you." She didn't ask why they were there. She didn't ask to see the warrant. She simply stood up, allowed herself to be handcuffed, and was escorted to a waiting vehicle. The search of her house took 6 hours. Agents found very little: some clothing, basic furniture, kitchen supplies, and a small amount of cash. There were no photographs, no letters, no personal items of any kind. The house felt like a stage set rather than a home. In a hollowed-out space beneath a floorboard in the bedroom, agents discovered a small notebook filled with numbers in the same code pattern as the envelopes she'd been receiving. They also found $3,000 in cash, wrapped in plastic. Nothing else of significance. Dennis Hartwell was arrested at the Library of Congress at 6:15 a.m., just as he arrived for work. FBI agents met him in the parking lot before he could enter the building. He was carrying his briefcase, which agents immediately seized. Inside, they found a miniature camera, 3 rolls of undeveloped film, and photocopies of document request forms from the manuscript division. Hartwell's first words, according to the arrest report, were, "I want a lawyer." He said nothing else during the entire arrest process. Unlike Chenoweth and Hofstedt, Hartwell appeared agitated, repeatedly asking when he would be allowed to make a phone call. Agents transported him to FBI headquarters in Washington and placed him in an interview room where he sat silently for 4 hours until a public defender arrived. The arrests generated immediate media coverage. By noon on October 17th, all 3 major television networks had reported the story. The headlines described it as "Soviet Spy Ring Exposed in Washington" and "FBI Breaks Cold War Espionage Network." The stories emphasized that the investigation had begun with a postal worker noticing suspicious mail patterns. Thomas Brennan's name wasn't released publicly, but within the Postal Service, word spread quickly. Colleagues who had worked with him for years suddenly looked at him differently. Some treated him as a hero who had protected national security. Others treated him with suspicion, as if his willingness to report irregularities made him untrustworthy. Frank Kerrigan told Thomas that the Postal Inspector's Office wanted to give him a commendation. Thomas said he didn't want any recognition. He just wanted to continue his route. The legal proceedings that followed revealed the full scope of the network's operations. During interrogation, Dennis Hartwell broke first. His attorney negotiated a plea agreement in exchange for cooperation. Hartwell explained that he'd been recruited during his 1971 trip to East Berlin by a man who claimed to represent a historical research institute interested in American policy documents. The man had cultivated the relationship over several months, initially just asking Hartwell to share his academic observations about American political culture. Gradually, the requests became more specific. Could Hartwell access certain types of documents? Could he photograph them? The man never explicitly identified himself as Soviet intelligence, and Hartwell claimed he'd convinced himself he was just helping foreign scholars who couldn't access American archives easily. By the time he realized he was involved in espionage, he felt trapped. He'd accepted small payments, $500 here, $1,000 there, and he'd been told that if he tried to stop cooperating, evidence of his previous activities would be sent to American authorities. Hartwell had been photographing documents since 1973, approximately once a month, always through the dead drop system. Robert Chenoweth never cooperated. He refused to speak to investigators beyond confirming basic biographical information. His attorney entered a not guilty plea, and Chenoweth went to trial in federal court in early 1979. The prosecution presented the physical evidence: the typewriter, the envelopes, the code sheets, the photograph of Anna Malikova. They presented testimony from postal workers, FBI agents, and handwriting experts. They established that Chenoweth had been sending coded messages to a known Soviet intelligence officer operating under false identity. The defense argued that Chenoweth was simply corresponding with an old friend, that the codes were a private game, that there was no proof of espionage. The jury deliberated for 2 days and found Chenoweth guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy to commit espionage and transmitting national defense information to a foreign government. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. At his sentencing hearing, when asked if he had anything to say, Chenoweth spoke for the only time during the entire legal process. He said, "I have nothing to regret." The judge asked if he understood the seriousness of his crimes against his country. Chenoweth said, "I understand exactly what I've done." He was transported to a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania and placed in a unit that housed other prisoners convicted of espionage-related offenses. Margaret Hofstedt's case was more complex because of the question of her true identity. The FBI believed she was Anna Malikova, trained by Soviet intelligence in the early 1950s and inserted into the United States under false documentation. But proving this, definitively, was difficult. The woman calling herself Margaret Hofstedt refused to cooperate with investigators. She wouldn't confirm or deny any identity. She wouldn't explain how she'd obtained her social security number, her employment records, or her documented history. She simply remained silent. The FBI brought in specialists who attempted to match her fingerprints and photographs with records from Czech archives, but the Soviet government refused to provide any assistance or confirmation. Without cooperation from Soviet authorities, and without Hofstedt's own testimony, the FBI couldn't prove her original identity beyond the circumstantial evidence of the photograph and the gaps in her documentation. The prosecution proceeded anyway, charging her with espionage, conspiracy, and acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign government. Her trial began in June 1979. The evidence against her was substantial. The coded envelopes, the dead drops, the document exchanges with Yuri Petrov, the testimony from Dennis Hartwell describing how she'd served as the coordinator for the network. But Hofstedt's defense attorney argued that the prosecution couldn't prove she'd known the documents were intended for Soviet intelligence. Perhaps she'd been manipulated. Perhaps she'd thought she was helping academic researchers. Perhaps she was a victim rather than a perpetrator. The jury didn't find these arguments persuasive. They convicted her on all counts. At sentencing, the judge noted that Hofstedt had maintained a false identity for decades, had coordinated espionage activities, and had shown no remorse or willingness to acknowledge her actions. She was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. During her incarceration, Hofstedt never spoke about her past. She was housed at a federal prison in West Virginia, where she worked in the library and kept to herself. Other inmates reported that she was polite but remote, never discussing her case or her life before prison. In 1985, during a period of diplomatic negotiations between the United States and Soviet Union regarding prisoner exchanges, Soviet officials informally indicated interest in arranging Hofstedt's release as part of a trade. The American government explored this possibility, viewing it as confirmation that Hofstedt was indeed a Soviet intelligence officer. But the negotiations fell apart over disagreements about which American prisoners the Soviets would release in exchange. Hofstedt remained in custody. She died in prison in 1993, at age 88, from complications related to pneumonia. Her death certificate listed her name as Margaret Hofstedt. Her body was cremated at state expense. No one claimed the ashes. Yuri Petrov, the Soviet diplomat who had received the documents from Hofstedt, was declared persona non grata by the State Department on October 18, 1978, the day after the arrests. He was given 72 hours to leave the United States. Soviet officials protested the expulsion, claiming Petrov was a legitimate cultural attaché who had no involvement in espionage. The State Department released photographs showing Petrov accepting materials from Hofstedt at the bus shelter, making the Soviet denials implausible. Petrov departed the United States on October 20, 1978. According to CIA sources, He returned to Moscow and continued working for Soviet intelligence services, eventually retiring in the late 1980s. He was never prosecuted for his role in the network. The broader investigation revealed that the network had been operational since at least 1973, possibly earlier. FBI analysts estimated that Dennis Hartwell had photographed and transmitted approximately 300 documents from the Library of Congress during his 5 years of espionage activity. Most of these documents dealt with Cold War policy formation, diplomatic negotiations, military strategy debates, and internal government decision-making processes from the 1960s and early 1970s. While none of the documents were technically classified, they were historical materials donated to public archives. Their collective value to Soviet intelligence was significant. They provided detailed insight into how American foreign policy was actually formulated, who the key decision-makers were, what their personal biases and conflicts were, and how policy debates were resolved. This type of information allowed Soviet analysts to build sophisticated models for predicting American behavior and identifying potential vulnerabilities in the decision-making process. The FBI's counterintelligence division used the case as a training example for years afterward, emphasizing how small observational details, like a postal worker noticing repeated envelopes, could lead to major intelligence breakthroughs. The case also highlighted the effectiveness of long-term Soviet deep-cover operations. Margaret Hofstedt, or Anna Malikova, had maintained a false identity for at least 9 years, possibly longer, living quietly in Georgetown while coordinating espionage activities. She'd never drawn attention to herself. She'd never made operational errors. She'd executed her role with discipline and patience. The only reason she'd been caught was because Robert Chenoweth's envelope production had been too consistent, creating a pattern that Thomas Brennan had noticed. Thomas Brennan received a letter of commendation from the FBI director and a small ceremony at the Georgetown postal station where he was recognized for his contribution to national security. The ceremony was brief and awkward. Thomas stood in the sorting room wearing his postal uniform while Frank Kerrigan read the commendation letter, and a few colleagues clapped politely. A photographer from the Postal Service newsletter took a picture. Thomas shook hands with an FBI official who thanked him for his vigilance. The whole event lasted maybe 15 minutes. Afterward, Thomas returned to his mail truck and continued his route. He delivered to 2847 Q Street that day. The house was empty, sealed by the FBI during their investigation. He put the mail through the slot as always. Bills and advertisements, accumulating for a resident who would never return. The attention Thomas received within the Postal Service was uncomfortable. Some colleagues treated him with respect, acknowledging that his observation had been important. Others treated him with resentment, as if he'd violated some unspoken code by reporting something unusual rather than ignoring it. A few people made jokes about him being a spy hunter, looking through everyone's mail for secret messages. The jokes were supposed to be friendly but felt hostile. Thomas didn't respond to them. He just did his job. Patricia asked him if he regretted making the report. He thought about it for a while, then said no. He'd noticed something wrong, and reporting it had been the right thing to do. But he also said he hadn't understood how complicated the consequences would become. Patricia said that was always how it worked. Small actions had large effects, and you couldn't predict them ahead of time. By 1980, the media attention had faded. The spy case was old news. Thomas continued working his Georgetown route until 1989, when he retired after 22 years with the Postal Service. He received a standard retirement ceremony, a plaque, and a small pension. He and Patricia moved to a smaller house in Maryland. They visited their daughters on holidays. Thomas watched baseball, maintained a garden, and rarely talked about the envelope case unless someone specifically asked about it. When people did ask, usually friends who remembered the news coverage from 1978, Thomas would give a brief, factual account. He'd noticed suspicious mail, reported it, and the FBI had investigated. He didn't embellish the story. He didn't claim credit for bringing down a spy ring. He described it the way he experienced it, as a postal worker who noticed something irregular and followed the proper reporting procedure. Dennis Hartwell served 7 years in federal prison before being released on parole in 1986. His cooperation with prosecutors, combined with arguments that he'd been coerced and manipulated by Soviet handlers, resulted in a reduced sentence. After his release, he moved to a small town in Oregon and worked at a community college library under a different name. He never gave interviews about his espionage activities. According to parole records, he complied with all supervision requirements and lived quietly until his death from heart disease in 2004. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of his espionage conviction, listing him only as a retired librarian. Robert Chenoweth remained in federal prison until his death in 1997 at age 70. He never explained his motivations or acknowledged his actions beyond the brief statement at his sentencing. Prison records indicated he was a model inmate who worked in the prison library, tutored other prisoners in mathematics, and maintained minimal contact with the outside world. He received no visitors after his first year of incarceration. FBI analysts who reviewed his case in later years concluded that Chenoweth had probably been recruited during a trip to Europe in the 1950s. His travel records showed a brief visit to France in 1956 and had likely been operating as a Soviet asset for more than 20 years before his arrest. But without his cooperation, much of his story remained unknown. The photograph of Anna Malikova found in his apartment suggested some personal connection, possibly a romantic relationship formed during his recruitment, but this was never confirmed. Chenoweth took those details to his grave. The house at 2847 Q Street Northwest remained empty for several years after Margaret Hofstedt's arrest. The federal government seized it as proceeds of crime, since Hofstedt had purchased it with funds believed to have come from Soviet intelligence services. Eventually, the property was auctioned and sold to a private buyer who renovated it and rented it out. By the mid-1980s, the house looked like any other Georgetown residence, well-maintained, unremarkable, with no indication that it had once been the center of a Cold War espionage operation. The new residents had no connection to the previous events. They were simply people who needed a place to live in an expensive neighborhood. The broader implications of the case extended beyond the 3 individuals arrested. The FBI used the investigation to identify vulnerabilities in how federal agencies handled historical documents and archives. The Library of Congress implemented new security procedures for manuscript collections, requiring more detailed documentation of who accessed sensitive materials and what they examined. Other research institutions followed similar protocols. The case also reinforced concerns about Soviet deep cover operations and the difficulty of identifying illegals who'd been inserted into American society decades earlier. The FBI estimated that there were potentially dozens of other Soviet illegals operating in the United States with false identities, some dating back to the 1940s or 1950s, but most would never be identified unless they made operational errors or were betrayed by defectors. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought new information about Cold War espionage operations, but not about this particular case. Soviet intelligence archives were partially opened to researchers in the 1990s, and some files were declassified, but the files related to deep cover illegals remained classified. The woman known as Margaret Hofstedt was never officially acknowledged by Russian authorities as having been a Soviet intelligence officer. Her true identity, whether she was Anna Malikova or someone else entirely, remains unconfirmed. The most comprehensive account of the case came from FBI files that were partially declassified in 2008, 30 years after the arrests. These files confirmed the basic facts: the coded envelopes, the dead drops, the document theft, the arrests. But they couldn't answer deeper questions about motivation, recruitment, and personal history. What remains certain is that an ordinary postal worker, doing an ordinary job, noticed something wrong and chose to report it. That observation, combined with 6 months of methodical FBI investigation, exposed an espionage network that had been operating successfully for years. The case didn't prevent a war. It didn't stop a nuclear crisis. It didn't change the course of the Cold War. It simply removed 3 people from active intelligence work and temporarily disrupted Soviet access to one particular stream of information. In the context of global superpower competition, it was a small victory, barely notable. But in the context of individual lives, it was decisive. 3 people went to prison. One postal worker's career was quietly complicated. And somewhere in Moscow, intelligence officers adjusted their operational protocols and continued their work. The tragedy of the story isn't that the network was caught. The tragedy is that it existed at all, that systems of suspicion and secrecy had created circumstances where people could spend years, even decades, living false lives in service of governments that viewed them as disposable assets. Robert Chenoweth spent 20 years producing coded messages and maintaining contact with a network that ultimately abandoned him. Margaret Hofstedt, or whoever she actually was, spent at least 9 years living in complete isolation, performing a role with no personal connections, no real identity, no life beyond the operational requirements of espionage. Dennis Hartwell convinced himself he was serving scholarship when he was actually serving intelligence services that would have discarded him without hesitation if he'd become inconvenient. And Thomas Brennan, who did nothing more than notice an irregularity and report it through proper channels, found himself caught in machinery much larger than he'd anticipated. The Cold War produced thousands of stories like this, people trapped in systems they didn't fully understand, making choices based on incomplete information, suffering consequences that seemed disproportionate to their actions. The grand narrative of superpower competition, nuclear standoff, and ideological conflict was experienced at the individual level as confusion, fear, betrayal, and loss. The people who served as intelligence officers, assets, and sources were rarely the ideological warriors portrayed in propaganda. They were accountants, librarians, elderly women living in Georgetown houses, postal workers delivering mail. They were ordinary people who either chose or were forced to become participants in a conflict that had no clear victories, only temporary advantages and permanent casualties. If this case makes you think about how close the machinery of the Cold War came to ordinary lives, how a simple observation could trigger consequences that lasted decades, then you understand something essential about that era. These weren't just spy games or political theater. They were real people making real choices that destroyed real futures. Subscribe if you want to hear more cases like this, not because they're entertaining, but because they're warnings about what happens when systems of secrecy and suspicion become normalized. Wars may end, but the files remain, the names change, the consequences persist. And somewhere, always, someone is noticing something wrong and deciding whether to report it.